Welcome, and thank you for joining us today on the Heroes and Icons podcast. I'm your host, Greg Randolph. Please find me on the X at Greg Heroes Icons, also known as the Heroes and Icons podcast, to get updates for great shows like this and others. I'm also a featured podcaster on HoustonCityBeat.com. That's a cool website for local happenings in businesses here in the Houston area, so please check them out too. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with a friend, and thank you so much for doing that. We have a very special guest today. If you're a sports fan, especially of any happenings in the last almost 40 years in the South Florida market, this gentleman needs no introduction. He has been a columnist for the Sun Sentinel since 1990, and in 2016 was named the National Headliner Award Columnist of the Year. He has written a few sports books, two of which we will discuss a bit today, and they are Still Perfect, The Untold Story of the 1972 Miami Dolphins, and Perfection with 1972 Dolphins Hall of Fame quarterback Bob Griese. My guest today is author and Sun Sentinel sports columnist Dave Hyde. It's a great honor to have you on the show with me today, sir. How are you doing, Dave, and what's keeping you busy?
I'm doing great. What's keeping me busy? A lot happening in South Florida. I was just at the Marlins practice today. They're about to start baseball. Always writing about the Dolphins all year round. And the Heat and the Panthers are charging up for the playoffs. So it's a busy sports scene right here. And fortunately, the Dolphins are the one team that has the most attention and the least playoff wins to show for it of late. So let's go back in time to 72 when they were winning big.
Let me start off. I want to ask you a couple of small questions about a couple other teams. In 1997, the Florida Marlins won the World Series. What did that do for the area and the city? And then how important was that Craig Council, the chicken runs at midnight? How important was that to the whole year?
Yeah, well, it was a crazy run because really up till that time, we had the Heat starting to, Pat Riley had just come to town a couple years earlier. Right. And the Panthers in 97 also made a run to the Stanley Cup Finals. And all of a sudden, we weren't just a football exclusive town where, the Dolphins had the trademark on sports in South Florida, and the Hurricanes had their moments too. All of a sudden, we were blind. In fact, they had a charity dinner, I remember that year, 97, after the Marlins run. And they had the four coaches there. And they were Pat Riley, Jim Leland was the Marlins manager. I get the Marlins World Series mixed up. So Jim Leland, Doug McClain took his Panthers to the Stanley Cup Finals. And then Jimmy Johnson was with the Dolphins at the time. And you looked at those guys, and it looked like a Mount Rushmore of who's great coaching in that moment. And really, three of them are Hall of Famers: Johnson, Pat Riley, and Jim Leland. But that Marlins run was rare because up until a couple of years before that, a few years before that, there wasn't any baseball in town. So it was a lot of fun.
Oh, good deal. And then with the Panthers coming in around that time or within a few years here or there, what was that like to have a hockey team come into a southern state where hockey didn't previously exist too much?
Yeah, it was an education for a lot of people. Now, I grew up playing hockey, but
sure.
In South Florida, I remember that during that Stanley Cup run, there were questions like, how much does a puck weigh? And people were guessing 2 pounds. And I mean, things that no way the puck could move that quick. So there was a whole education process. How do they switch lines? But like anything else, the surprise is always the best story in sports. And you didn't have to be a hockey fan in 97 to understand. Nobody thought the Panthers were any good at the start of the year, and all of a sudden they're making a run through the playoffs, and they're in the Stanley Cup Finals. And everybody loves a winner, so everybody hopped on board, and that was a lot of fun. That was probably the most fun covering a team I had, just because of the players involved and the surprise, the shock of it all.
So let's jump into the Dolphins now. As we mentioned in the intro, you've authored two amazing books regarding the undefeated 1972 Miami Dolphins. There's Still Perfect, the Untold Story of that team, and then Perfection with Bob Griese. How did those two masterpieces come about? Did the team come to you? Was it your idea to write? Did Dick Anderson or somebody from that team come to you, or how did that all unfold?
Yeah, no. So I came here in '85 and worked for the Herald for 5 years, And then I was a columnist. And in that time, you can't help but hear about the 72 Dolphins. And I'd done stories on these guys. And these were amazing personalities. I'm thinking as a writer, you look, not only characters, but they're full of stories. And it's at the right time in their lives where they'll tell you all their stories. Okay. Right. They're far enough away from their playing careers and they have such good stories to tell that I thought, I looked and no one had done a book on them. And now here we are. We're going to be 30 years removed from it. And I thought, I want to do a book on these guys. So I just went down a list, started calling one of them and interviewing them, and met with Mercury Morris at a restaurant in South Miami, and Bob Kuchenberg at the hotel in Hollywood, and talked to guys on the phone for a couple hours, and everybody was great with their time. I went up to Cairo, Georgia, and saw Bill Stanfill, and they're paying the cost of playing football. Like Bill Stanfill, he'd have a can of soda on his desk, and it'd be half full, and that's all he could drink because he couldn't tilt his neck any further back because fused discs from playing football. So all these guys, but they all had incredible stories to tell about that season and that team. And I just thought, as a writer, I thought, boy, this would be a great thing to put together. And Don Shula was all for it when I told him, and he agreed to write the foreword to the book. And so it made the interesting thing, that provided me with so much column material for years and years, including the one guy who wouldn't talk for the story was Jake Scott. And so I told our editors, look, this guy lives in Hawaii. And in fact, I asked Jim Mandich, he was good friends with Jake, hey, can you set me up with an interview? I can't get him. And he said, Howard Cosell, the New York Times. He went through all these guys who come to me through the years trying to he won't talk. So I told my editor, hey, if we ever get any extra money, send me to Hawaii and I'll try to find Jake Scott. And he goes, oh yeah, send you to Hawaii, sure. Well, about 3 years later, my editor, Brian White, he had a change. He became a sports editor and he said, hey, we're going to send you to Hawaii to find Jake Scott. And I found his address and I drove in there, and some guy was in the driveway getting in an SUV. And I said, Jake, because I didn't know what he looked like exactly. And he goes, no, Jake's up in the house. So I went, knocked on the door. Here came Jake Scott through the door. And he goes, I don't want a story done on me. Don't want a story. And we talked for a few minutes. He goes, I tell you what, meet me at this bar in Hanalei, Hawaii, at 5 o'clock. And I walked in there, and there he is sitting at the bar. And if you ever watch the movie The Descendants with George Clooney, Bo Bridges is sitting in the seat Jake sat every day at 5 o'clock. And the two people on either side of him are the people Jake sat with every day at 5 o'clock. I walked out of that bar at 2:30 in the morning with a story. So he was great. Jake was great.
What was he like, though? He was such a legend with, I don't know if he told you any stories about his days at Georgia. He rode his motorcycle on top of the gym and the confrontations with coaches and all those things. But what was he like, and what was his relationship with Coach Shula?
Oh, well, a lot to unpack there. What was he like? Well, for me, he was great. He was phenomenal. Sat down next to him, ordered a beer. He ordered a salty dog vodka drink, and we just sat and talked about living in Hawaii and his life. But he's, to tell you who he is, he's the one guy. He was in the Canadian League, and there's a story in that. And you mentioned Georgia. Vince Dooley promised his players they get to pick which bowl game to go to if they won a certain game. They won the game, and they elected Jake to walk into his room with a bushel of oranges to say we want to go to the Orange Bowl. And Vince told him, too late, I already picked the Sugar Bowl. And when Vince Dooley lied to the team like that, Jake cut him off in his life. He left Georgia after his junior year, went to Canadian League to play football. So he's very principled and very cut and dried. Either he likes you or he doesn't like you. But to tell also what he was, when he came down to the Dolphins, he's the one guy the veterans stayed away from. Like all the other first timers, the rookies, they had sing, the hazy sing your fight song. Nobody suggested Jake do that because nobody wanted to hear the repercussions. So he's a fascinating guy and a phenomenal guy to write a story about.
I'm glad that you got to do that, and I'm also glad that he and Shula were able to make amends.
He and Shula had a falling out, just like he and Vince Dooley did, but they met up at a card show, I want to say in 2010, 11, 12, something like that, years after. And it was inside the team. It was such a talking point that they didn't get along and hadn't talked to each other in decades, that when they did make out, when Jake went over and shook his hand, guys got out phones and were taking pictures and they were sending them out. So, he was a dynamic inside the team. So very interesting.
Yeah. For me, at the very top of the mountain, as far as tough guys go, this story where there was a guy in the bar, maybe in Colorado, that challenged him and he said, "What are the rules?" And then he knocks him back down the stairs.
Yeah. They're walking up the stairs. And Jake says, "What are the rules?" And the guy says, "No rules." And he turns around and bam, pounds when the guy goes tumbling down. Yeah, he got in a lot of fights too.
Yeah, I'm sure he won all of them.
He from what everybody says, he did.
I bet. Great story. So what were some things about writing the book once you started to write it that maybe surprised you a bit in your research, or maybe there was something that you were surprised to learn about the team that you hadn't known?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of surprises because, I knew, for instance, Monty Clark, the offensive line coach. I knew Monty Clark, but I didn't know his story and what he brought to the team. And he just retired as a player, and Don Shula interviews him over the phone. Come to Miami. Now, they had no offensive linemen. They had Larry Little. But that was, and Norm Evans, but it was a terrible offensive line. In fact, when Shula met Bob Griese, he said, "Hey, I want you to stay in the pocket." And Griese's response was, "Build me a pocket and I'll stay in it." Because Griese had a reputation as a scrambling quarterback his first couple of years. So Monty Clark comes in and he finds Wayne Moore. The 49ers were trying to keep him on their practice squad. He gets Jim Langer off the Browns waiver wire. And all of a sudden, Bob Kuchenberg came in. He played semi-pro football in Chicago the year before, and he picked the Dolphins because he saw how bad their line was, and he thought, I can make that team. And so all of a sudden, they got the clay of the makings of a good line. But Monty Clark was fascinating because he believed in visualization, and he'd have players talk through their blocking and close their eyes and visual. And this was at a time when such ideas were out there a little, but some people didn't think it happened. In fact, the veteran center, Bob DeMarco, wanted nothing to do with this stuff. But when you ask me what surprised me, it's the stories that went into making this great team that I didn't know about, and the personalities. Monty Clark was a fascinating part of it.
Interesting. I know there was just a plethora of stories that we could certainly talk about, but again, that falls under the Ken Burns documentary part. But the early 70s was a different time. There was a lot going on. There were Vietnam protests, they had everything else. And Shula changed the rooming lineups when the team went on the road. What was your sense of what it was like for the team to play in that particular era?
Well, I mean, Larry Little grew up in Miami. And when he went to the Orange Bowl, he went to an all-black high school. In fact, a lot of these guys, like Larry Little, there's probably a dozen guys on both sides of the ball. Larry Little never played against a white player until the pros. Okay, but here's a fascinating story about the racial mix as I'm thinking about it. Vern Den Herder grew up in a small town in Iowa, farming town. He wanted to be a farmer, and he was roomed with Malty Moore, who is a black defensive player. Mm-hmm. Vern Den Herder is a white farmer from Iowa. Malty Moore is a black defensive lineman who worked on highways. He was part of the highway crew. Yeah. And a high school coach at Bethune-Cookman saw him playing basketball after he's working on a crew one day, and he saw his feet working. He goes, he was a football guy. Hey, do you ever play football? That's how he got into football. And all of a sudden, this Iowa farm guy and this guy who grew up in the black part of the South were roommates. And neither had been around the other race at all in their lives. And they talk about, okay, they didn't become best friends, but for the first time, they'd come. One was, I think, Vernon Herb was a 9th-round pick, and Moldy Moore might have been undrafted. But either way, neither of them in 1970 when they came in were sure to make the team. But for the first time in their life, they saw someone of the other race doing the exact same things they were, with the exact same hopes and the exact same aspirations to make a career. And they both made the team. And even at that Super Bowl, they asked each other, what are you going to do with the winning money? And Vernon Herder talked about a cow he was going to buy. And Moldy Moore talked about this house he wanted, this air-conditioned house. And I talked to him years later when I was doing the book, and both of them, they've talked about this since, but both of them at the time were thinking, why would he want a cow? What's that? Well, it was a stud cow to start a ranch, okay? And Vernon Herder's thinking, why would he want, what's so big about an air-conditioned house? Well, where Moldy Moore grew up, nobody had air-conditioned. It was a sign that you made it, okay? I have an air-conditioned house. So the outside world came in with all the, like the Democratic National Convention was in Miami Beach and with the riots and everything when the Dolphins were starting training camp. But really, it was more interpersonal relationships of the time than the big riots or whatever affecting them. But it was really interesting to do the book and hear their stories.
What an interesting time in history for sure. One part of the book that fascinated, one element was in 1971, there were a couple of sports psychology professors from San Jose State, Tutko and Ogilvy, and they approached NFL teams with a 190 question exam called the Athletic Motivational Inventory, and it was also known as the Instrument. And the Dolphins were off the charts for the motivation, and Shula was off the charts in a lot of areas and was unusually driven. How important was this for Shula in assessing and motivating the team to that point?
Well, it's interesting because, again, Shula was ahead of his time in that department because I remember talking to the professor, I think it was Bruce Ogilvy, and they had lost the results and everything. But he went to some teams, didn't want to do it. Coaches said, no, that's not our cup of tea. They went to Shula and explained what they want to do, and they realized Shula agreed to it because he saw there was some information he could get from it too. That, okay, I can see where this team stacks up on different things, and that would help me, how to coach it. How do they respond to motivation? And so that tells you how forward thinking Shula was at the time. And his one proviso to doing the test was the players were given numbers, and only he knew what number matched to the players, so that there wasn't any repercussions of names getting out and test scores or anything. But again, Shula, you talk about unusually driven. Another thing that is almost lost in time is in 1970 when Shula came to the Dolphins. He lost the Super Bowl with the Colts to Joe Namath's Jets. He had lost a tight NFL title game years before when they were big favorites in Baltimore to Cleveland. And then he also had this rivalry with Vince Lombardi that dated back to Shula's time as defensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions, and Vince Lombardi having the hammer of the great line and great running game against it. And so Shula came in with all these motivations, really, but losses that fueled him. He went in that 72 Super Bowl. People were saying he couldn't win the big one. In fact, Carol Rosenblum, his former owner in Baltimore, made national headlines. He can't win the big one. And so the amount of pressure on Shula, we look now like, oh, the all-time winningest coach. He was always great. He wasn't. And this was a turning point in his career. Not only he won the big one, but he put a lot of ghosts to rest in doing so.
Another very charismatic figure in the 72 team and the franchise is Joe Robbie. And if there's no Joe Robbie, there's no Miami Dolphins. So After Shula was brought in, Shula changed the organization's culture with the winning edge and everything. But what was the team's relationship to Joe Robbie, especially where Shula was concerned?
Well, Shula would hire people, but he'd say, or allow people from the Dolphins organization, a couple guys, come and watch practice and everything with the understanding you can't go tell Joe anything. Okay, so the business offices were in Biscayne Boulevard in Miami, and the football offices were north. And it was like that. There was a split. It's unfortunate because, like you said, if the Dolphins didn't, if Joe Robbie didn't come around, and he built the Dolphins and bought them really on a shell game, as Al Davis, when he was the AFL commissioner, said, it's a shell game what they got going. He mortgaged his house. He put everything he had into buying the Dolphins, and with a limited partner in Danny Thomas. And it was the ultimate rags to riches American dream, however you want to phrase it. But he was a unique personality, and him and Shula didn't get along. And so that played out in that a lot of the team was for Shula. He was their coach. Joe, like a lot of owners at the time, wasn't really happy to spend money on the player, too much money on the players. So, but unique personality too.
Was Robbie, I don't want to say jealous, but that might be the right word. Was there any jealousy or resentment on his part towards Shula for getting the credit for the 72 team or any of those Super Bowls?
He built this team from nothing, right? He hired Shula. Right. And it's easy to understand through the filter of Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson in Dallas. You know, they were the next generation of Joe Robbie and Don Shula. Jerry said to Jimmy at one point, "I want some of the fun." You know, he wanted to be some of the claim. You know, you can go outside a second string right guard and people go, "Oh, Jimmy Johnson's great," but you know, I make a $10 million business deal, nobody says anything. So, and it was the same with Joe Robbie. Joe Robbie just wanted to be appreciated for what he did, which was build a team out of nothing. And within in 6 years, they went from an expansion team to the only undefeated team in NFL history. Well, sure, Don Shula and Joe Thomas, who was the general manager, were big pieces of that, but so is Joe Robbie. And Joe just wanted a little bit of the fun, you know. That's all he wanted.
In reading the book, he was really tough to kind of peg, because the second that you thought that he was this way, like maybe he was really hard on the contract with Stanfield, he would turn around and give Charlie Babb a 3-year guaranteed deal. And so he was tough to figure out a little bit. Yeah,
and Shula would say, I thought it was a big victory for us when I got someone to clean our offices twice a week instead of once a week. And yet, when Shula went to him and said, you know, he wanted to sign Earl Morrall for, you know, what was it, 100,000? It was a big sum.
Yeah.
He'd be behind, I think, only Griese on the roster for pay. And Shula explained, you know, we need this emergency in case something would happen to Bob. And he goes, let's do it. So he understood where to spend money, but at the same time, I remember Mike Rathett, the PR person for the Dolphins, wrote a bio on Joe Robbie and talked about the amount of money he gave to charities. And it came back from Joe, who had to approve it. Scratch, don't do that. And he goes, but that's the essence of good PR for you. That'll help people understand. He goes, I want them to think I'm the meanest son of a bitch in town when I go into contracts negotiations. So that was him.
The ownership, to me, one of the big untold stories in the book was the backstory on some local businessmen coming to the rescue to save a gentleman named Bud Keeland from relocating the team to Seattle. I thought that was a very big part of the picture too, that's maybe lost in the whole story.
Yeah, it's weird because I didn't know any of this till I started getting into it and realized that Joe had brought all these minority partners in because, again, he didn't have money. He was mortgaging his house, as part of everything he had was in the Dolphins, but he needed money. And all of a sudden, some of these minority partners saying they weren't getting enough money. Like I said, the AFL realized there's a shell game going on, and they don't have all this money they say they have. And lo and behold, Keelan was going to take it to Seattle, and all of a sudden, a couple of Miami guys got a call. Miami guys, old time Miami, with money, and they weren't football fans, but they were Miami fans. They understood the value of having a AFL team at the time in town, and they backed Joe, and they put money behind him, and that allowed the team to stay in. But yeah, it was touch and go here for a while. That the Dolphins, maybe they would have been the Seattle Dolphins.
Gosh, that's a crazy thing to entertain, but fortunately for us, that didn't happen, and history worked out. So it's pretty obvious too that Zonka was one of the driving force on that team. He goes after his rookie year. He goes and talks to Joe Thomas, the general manager, and insists that he trade or get Larry Little in a trade from San Diego. And he was an agent of sorts for his teammates after he and Kick and Warfield signed with the WFL. And just a great teammate and really quick to deflect any type of credit that he might have gotten to anyone else. But was there anything that was intriguing about Zonka that wasn't told over the years? Anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, he was a larger than life character. I mean, look what he did after football. In fact, a lot of these guys after football, they sort of defined who they were. Larry went to Alaska and did a nature show for years there. In fact, he had to be pulled out of the Sea of Alaska when his boat was sinking, and he wrote, the guy who pulled him out, he wrote on it, "Thanks for pulling my ass out of the water," or whatever. Yeah. So he was a complete character, and he came to define the Dolphins. He got the unnecessary roughing penalty when he punched. He's running with the ball and he punches a buffalo, but to Shula, it was very important that Larry stepped up. And Larry had concussion problems at the start of his career. There was a question, and really Jim Kick was the better back for the first couple of years of their career. And then Shula comes in and he gets this great line. And Shula now, thinking back on Shula, how Shula's thinking went, he'd just been beaten up by Vince Lombardi with Jim Taylor and Paul Hornung. Now he had the hammer. He had Larry Zonka. And he's going to pound, and he has this great offensive line. Kuchenberg, I thought, had the defining statement of that team. He goes, "We were the perfect match in that we would get Larry the first 2 yards, and he would get up steam, and he would get the next 3 yards, and we would go first and 10 to second and 5, or whatever." But they had this machine, and it was a perfect time in football to have a player like that, and the perfect team because, they had Paul Warfield too, but he was underused, and Griese too. He went from the scrambling quarterback to the thinking man's quarterback, and all of a sudden he can't really pass. Well, when Zonka left in '76, he led the league in, I think, touchdowns or quarterback rating, one of the big quarterback stats. So a lot of the Warfields and Grieses minimized their talents on some level because they understood they had this horse in Zonka and this great running game.
So another thing that kind of stuck out to me was that Don Shula was actually number 3 on the list to replace George Wilson in 1970 because the team had talked to Eric Parsegian of Notre Dame and then Bear Bryant. But was it apparent to everyone once Shula came in and started instituting, his way of doing things, that he was just ultimately the right coach for this team?
Well, I remember Nick Bonicani talking about how going on an airplane on away games, just as for instance, it was like a flying cocktail party, he called it.
Right.
And because there was no discipline, there were parties of Joe Robbie bringing potential, investors to the team. They'd be partying, the drinks would start flowing. And when Shula came, none of that, all that cut out. It was a business trip where, and so, Bonacani would say he would get the game plan, and it'd be pages and pages thick. And he'd say, "What am I going to do with this? Use it as toilet paper?" And now all of a sudden Shula came in and Bill Arnsbarger, and they ran a very simple, every Sunday he said, me and Bill and Shula, we'd sit and pick out the 5 or 6 defenses we were going to use mostly that day. And it'd be very simple, and it'd be effective against the defense, but you didn't have to know 25 different defenses. And so, and then the intensity that Shula brought was something off the charts. Nobody had seen anything like that before. 4 practices a day his first year, and I remember Mandich saying at the edge of the 72 Super Bowl, they were sitting there that Super Bowl weekend. He thought they were talking about what a madman Shula, how intense, and Mandich goes, "Oh my God, can you imagine what it would be like if we lose this game? What he'll be like next year?" Yeah, he was off the charts from what a lot of the players had seen before.
Yeah, he was just obsessed with being obsessed about getting to that and proving everyone wrong, that he could in fact win and be great and do it at the highest level. Let me ask you too about someone else, and I don't think this guy has talked about really enough on as far as the team and constructing the team. That's the general manager, Joe Thomas. How critical to the team was Thomas with the trades and then with drafting all the Hall of Famers that he did even before Shula got there?
Yeah, I mean, you look what here's a name that's really lost in time, unfortunately, because you go through the list. He got Larry Little for a high school teammate of his in Miami, Mac Lamb, a cornerback who didn't last. So a trade with San Diego. We got Nick Bonacani for a steal from the Patriots. He drafted Bob Griese. Now he drafted Rick Norton in '66, but he said, "I'm going to keep taking quarterbacks till I get one." And he took Griese the next year, and in fact, came down to Griese or Steve Spurrier, and he went up to Spurrier. He went up to Gainesville and sat in the office with Spurrier and his lawyer, and Spurrier was playing. I think he was playing solitaire the whole time, and he goes, "Okay, I can't handle that." And so other reasons too, of course, but he took Griese. You go down the list of steals. He got Jake Scott in for a 7th round pick, a flyer, because he was in Canada, playing in Canada, and he asked Bill Stanfield, who was his friend from Georgia, a good friend, whether he'd come, and he go, "Yeah, I think he'd come." So he took him as a flyer, 7th round pick. There's a guy who, Dick Anderson, 3rd round. You go through those drafts that he got and the trades he made, right down to Paul Warfield, being sort of the anchoring piece of the definitive home run piece they didn't have before. But they needed somebody like Shula to come in and organize it all and to point this team towards winning. And so it was almost a perfect match. Shula comes in. He's got all these guys who want to win but don't know how and aren't in a disciplined system. I mean, the previous coaching staff would go have martini lunches, and Bonacani would talk, they'd come back with alcohol in their breath. And so here comes Shula, exact opposite of all that. Football to a point nobody had seen before. And so it was a perfect match of time and place. Joe Thomas had set up these guys with great talent, and then Shula comes in and harnesses that talent and sees the talent in some cases.
Another amazing thing about this team is that literally every player made a contribution of some kind. And other guys that were on the bottom of the roster, Henry Stuckey suited up for Super Bowl VII. You had a guy named Billy Lothridge who filled in for Seipel for a couple games.
Charlie Babb made
Charlie Babb, the rookie.
So yeah, it's like as with any great season, you get great contributions from people you didn't expect. But the biggest one, of course, Earl Morrall comes into the game when into the season when Griese goes down, fifth game, and carries on, and all the players were scared because they'd seen Earl practice, and he'd throw ducks, and he'd throw a bad ball, and he'd go dag nabbit. And and so they're like, "Who's this old man coming in?" But they'd put a rocking chair in his locker. But he comes in, and like you said, they got unlikely contributions from across the roster. Which, when you have a great season, that's what happens.
Is Morrill the most unsung player on the team, or is it maybe? I mean, maybe there's Marlon Briscoe or someone else that I'm missing, but it seems like it might be Morrill, or maybe even Warfield, somebody like that.
Yeah, let's see, unsung players on that team. I'm probably not a good one to ask. I mean, the whole offensive line to me was, Manny Fernandez might be an unsung hero. He had 17 tackles in the Super Bowl, 17 for a defensive tackle. To have 17 tackles, and he wasn't the MVP of the game. Jake Scott was, because the story, I talked to Dick Schaap, he fell asleep during the game. He'd been out partying the night before, and he wasn't really paying attention. He looked at the stat sheet and saw Jake Scott had 2 interceptions and said, "Oh, he must be the MVP." So he made him the MVP. But Manny Fernandez, if you're maybe unsung heroes, it might be him for anchoring a defensive line. And another guy that Joe Thomas found, he was Joe Robbie didn't allow undrafted players to be signed from west of the Mississippi because it would cost too much money to bring them in. But he made an exception for Manny Fernandez, with the idea being that Manny was of Hispanic descent coming into Miami. It'd be a selling point. Well, Manny was not Cuban; he's Mexican, and he didn't speak any Spanish. So,
oh man. Let me ask you this. With Nick Bonacani's Hall of Fame speech, where he says, you're not looking at the face of Nick Bonacani, you're looking at the bust of the 1972 no-name defense. Is he the Hall of Fame representative for the defense, or is there someone else on the team that should be in Canton but's not?
No. A lot of these guys had Hall of Fame stretch of 6-7 years. Dick Anderson, unfortunately, he would have been right there. He's a defensive player of the year. He had big moments and big games. And he goes to the Pro Bowl in 77, I believe, and he gets clipped, and ACL's torn, and at a time when people don't come back from ACL. So he would have been, if he could have played a few more years, he would have been a sure candidate for the Hall of Fame. But a lot of these guys, like Jake Scott, I think he made 4 or 5 Pro Bowls. But they had Manny Fernandez, a great 5 years, great 6 years. But to be in the Hall of Fame, you got to, unless you're Gale Sayers or something, you really need a decade or something like that. And they didn't have a great decade. So Nick did. I think he played 13 years, I believe.
Yeah.
And he was in the AFL. He was in the Boston Patriots Hall of Fame. He's in the Dolphins Ring of Honor. He had all the numbers, all the accolades, and he had everything but great size. He was Zach Thomas of his era. Great defensive player, middle linebacker, all these guys were fortunate to play with each other too, because all of a sudden, if they had these careers in other places, maybe they could have got unnoticed. All of a sudden, they're on a perfect team. Team goes to the Super Bowl 3 straight years, right. and their stars rise too.
What do you think about Kuchenberg as far as that discussion goes?
I was all in favor of Kuchenberg. Of course, I'm a homer for these guys, but Kuchenberg, he played he was all pro guard many times. Then Shula Needham, they didn't have a tackle one year in '78. Hey, can you play? Yeah, I'll play. He was all pro at tackle. There's stats like nobody has played I can't recreate it off the top of my head, but the fact is nobody's played more consecutive years and made more Pro Bowls and isn't in the Hall of Fame
Yeah.
than Kuchenberg. And so, I think it just came to the point was how many guys from that team can we put in the Super Bowl or in the Hall of Fame? And he was like a musical chairs. He's the odd man left out.
Um, that seems rather unfair. I mean, it seems like if someone's deserving, he's being penalized for what his team accomplished. So that's pretty crazy to me. But maybe that happens one day.
And he's a great. I would have loved to have heard his Hall of Fame speech because he was a nut. He was his father was a human cannibal,
Right.
and
Right.
they told him you can either be a human cannibal or find something else. He found football.
I tell you what, that's I don't want to say a regret that I have with this podcast, but I really wish that I'd had the wherewithal to start this, at least 5 years ago and talk to a Bob Kuchenberg or a Jim Mandich, these guys that we've lost too soon. But I'm glad
Some of them are still around. You can still catch them. You can still catch some of them. But yeah, there's I think is it 16 or 17? I'm not sure the exact number when they had the reunion a year ago,
Mhm.
or was it 2 years ago now? That I went to the dinner and it was really interesting. The speech was given and a toast made to the guys who weren't there anymore, of which Shula, of course, was one of them.
Sure, sure. What a great thing. How did I've just got a few more things here, and then we'll call it a night if that's okay. How did the Dolphins help galvanize the city of Miami as coming in and being a big thing? And then Howard Kindig even mentioned to me that as the team kept winning, the crime rate went down because the criminal element would be more focused on the team winning and not other nefarious things.
Okay, I didn't know that. I'm not disputing them. That's interesting.
Yeah, it was.
But yeah, remember Miami in the early '70s wasn't the Miami anything close to the Miami. It was a fun and sun city. It was
Right.
there wasn't a whole lot to do here. There was no sports scene. The University of Miami, but it wasn't winning them. And so in '66, when Joe Robbie brings the Dolphins, a lot of people around the country said, why are they going to Miami? And you look at it from today's picture and you see, oh, look how it changed. But the Dolphins became the definition of South Florida to the nation, and certainly to the nation sports scene, because where nothing was there before, now all of a sudden they got a dynastic team. So there were a lot of, and but it was a different time. The players would park outside the Orange Bowl on the grass, and then they'd have a tailgate after the game, and fans would come over and talk with them and have a beer with them, and that's sort of the time that it was in Miami. It was a lot smaller. Things were on a human scale, and
Right.
television hadn't quite hit. It was starting to hit,
Hmm.
but it hadn't quite changed all sports like it soon did.
It was right there, but they helped build that foundation for sure. The NFL Network aired a special in the last year or two on the 72 team, and it was filmed at Coach Shula's home office. And, Zonka goes in, he pulls the files, and Shula had gone out to LA to chart the sun and where the sun was going to be at certain times of the day. But he also had almost a diet. The players was Zonka, Little, and Morris and Griese, I think, and maybe I'm missing somebody. But they remarked that Don Shula, I mean, the toughest of tough guys, had almost a diary type of entry. Did that type of thing, or him writing a letter of encouragement to Garrow after the past snafu in Super Bowl VII, did those surprise you at all?
Well, it's interesting. Shula kept diary every year. That was his thing. Every year, every practice, he'd write down, "Here's what we did here," and he was very meticulous. He was a
Yep.
he. You talk to his assistants; they talk these. I forget what kind of notebook it was, but it was the same notebook every year. And that way he'd have an index of, oh, here's where we were last year at this time, and here's what I was doing, or so he was a great note taker, and he kept all those, and a lot of them are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame right now. Some are still in at his house here, but they gave a lot of them to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. As far as the letter to Garrow, here's what happened there.
Okay.
So Garrow and Shula were playing golf in a charity thing. At the end, they're signing autographs, and someone yells out, "Hey, Coach, you're the greatest!" And Garrow says, "He's the greatest. He sent me the most important letter of my life." And he starts, and Shula's looking at him like, "What?" And they start talking. And what happened was, so Garrow is the clown prince of the Super Bowl, right? He throws a touchdown to Washington, and he comes home. He's a laughingstock, and he closes himself in his house for a couple of weeks. He won't come out, and he's depressed and everything. And he gets this letter from Don Shula that says, "I just want to remind you how important you were to our success. You know, we're expecting great things from you. Don't let a little adversity take away from what, blah, blah, blah." Letter of encouragement, and brought Garrow out of his funk. He came out, he found a way to laugh at it, and he ended up making a business out of that to the point that other players on the team grumbled about him. Made all that. He was scared of cowardly play, and he's making a lot of money. But Garrow laughed at him some. But anyways, back to the letter. They talked, Shula and Garrow talked that day after the golf tournament. They realized Shula didn't write the letter. Dorothy Shula wrote the letter.
Yeah.
as she would for him at times.
That's surprising, but also not very surprising at all. I would imagine. Gosh, let me ask you about Bob Griese here for just a minute, because you worked with him on a separate book, but he was a very interesting and a dynamic player too on this team with his play calling and everything else, and especially in the Minnesota game. You know, he called that they thought it was, he switched them up with pass and run because they played him in the preseason, and then he called that tight end delay to Mandich. It was just a great play. But what was Bob like to work with on that book?
Bob is great because he said he was great at math equations, and he saw football as a math equation. He'd take the film home and he'd look for clues to break it, and then all of a sudden he'd catch things that the team was doing and break it down, and he'd look for keys, and it was an equation to him to crack. And so he would come, and we talk about, we've hit a couple times a perfect time of place and people meeting. Mm-hmm. And it was the same with Bob, because here's this very smart, very talented quarterback, and all of a sudden Monty Clark brings with him, and Shula puts in this check with me system, which is you call two plays in the huddle, and it check with me, depending on, to simplify it, if you called an odd or even number first, that would tell you what play they're going to run. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, you alluded to the tests that this team underwent. Very smart players on the team, mm-hmm. off the charts. Very smart offensive line, very smart quarterback. You're taking advantage of something that in the NFL really hadn't seen the advancement of the check me system that the 72 Dolphins did. In fact, one of the games they played against Mike Curtis of Baltimore, mm-hmm. he came to the sideline and he said, "I know they're doing something to change the play, but I just can't figure out what they're doing." Because this is something that hadn't reached the full NFL yet. So anyways, for Bob, it was a perfect system in that it relied on his smarts to read the defense, which he could do, and run the right play, which he could do. And he was so humble as far as his own stats. as he proved in the '73 Super Bowl, I think he threw 7 times and completed 6. And so he didn't need to, he wanted to win. And so it was a perfect match in that regard too.
In writing that book with him and everything, do you feel as if he, and I feel this way, but I kind of feel like he got a bad rap as being listed as, what, aloof or, or too reserved and being too focused on his family and not going out and being a partier, but more concerned about being home for his wife and kids. And then, but Shula trusted him though. He trusted him with the film and he was going to do his work anyway. But did he get an unfair rap in that regard?
I don't think so. I think that's who he was. I mean,
Well, sure.
yeah, and not in a bad way, but he was aloof. He was
Sure.
reserved.
Hmm.
I think Larry Seipels said he doesn't remember, and they lived in the same apartment complex for a while. That not trading many. I can't remember the exact quote, but there wasn't a lot of give and take. But uh, the team trusted Bob. They understood they could win with Bob, and Bob didn't need to be everybody's best friends, but he was a huge family man. He'd go home. He didn't like going out, with the other players, and that's just who he was. And teams made up all sorts of different personalities, and
Hmm.
here their leader, their quarterback, was his own man in his own way too.
Well, we've covered a whole lot here. Let me ask you just a couple more things and we'll get on with other stuff today. It seems like with, in the last couple of years with the recent celebration of the 50th anniversary of the team defeating Washington, that there's even more respect for this team. Was the media reluctant over the years to give them the credit that they deserved somehow because of their schedule or this thing or that?
Yeah, I don't know what it was, but I know Shula certainly felt they didn't get their deserved when they ran a computer contest. Steve Sable did at NFL Films, and the
Yeah.
Dolphins lost to I think the '78 Steelers or something like
Mhm.
that. He called them up and reamed them out. How we didn't lose the game? How can your computer have us lose? So, but I do think there's a measure of overtime and other teams challenging the record. That people have come to appreciate the Dolphins, the '72 Dolphins, and/or at times grown tired of them too, because there's Mercury Morris on TV again talking about the '72 Dolphins. But when people say, "Oh, they're clinging to this achievement because that's their life," look, what these guys did beyond football is amazing. State senators
Yeah.
and doctors, and Nick Bonaconte was CEO of 2 Fortune 500 companies, and then he started the Miami Project when his son Mark got paralyzed. You go down the list of what these guys accomplished in business, and it backs up what they did, who they were on the football field.
No, absolutely. They're all great men and all very successful. After Super Bowl seven ended, the team wins. I think it was Carl Tassif, one of the assistant coaches, put greatest ever on the blackboard in the locker room. Is that the legacy of this team? I mean,
Yeah.
without question.
Whenever he'd ask Shula, he'd say, "Well, how do you define who's the best in sports?" And he goes, "Scoreboard." I go, "Okay," and he'd leave it at that. Meaning, nobody beat us on the scoreboard. No one. We were 17-0, and until somebody else matches that, then um, that's as good as any. In their mind, it ends the debate who's the greatest ever, and it's certainly it's hard to come up with a better way to define it than a team that didn't lose.
I couldn't agree more. And let me tell you, thank you very much for me personally for you writing this book and bringing these stories to life because otherwise I never would have heard them. And I got a great deal of personal enjoyment from all of your work and the book. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks. It was, that writing that book was a lot of fun. Like I said, getting to know those guys, um, all the stories they had. There were characters on that team, and so that was a lot of fun. It was the first book I did too, and so it was like a labor of love.
Are you working on any projects now? Any books forthcoming?
I'm doing a couple fiction books, but I'm
Mhm.
trying to figure out which one to do and get traction on them. But I finished a book last year with Jimmy Johnson, his Swagger,
Right.
a book about his career. And I'm trying to figure out where to go now.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to put links to all of those books on the show notes for the podcast so the listeners can go and buy those. And I highly recommend all of these books, especially if you're a Dolphins fan, NFL fan of pop culture. The 1972 book is I'll put up against any of them. It's really a great read just all the way
I
through.
appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, Greg. It was a lot of fun to do. So it's been a lot of fun talking with you.
No, likewise. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for spending some time with me today. And if there's any other way that I can support your books or your projects, let me know. I'll be happy to do it.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Oh,
Thanks for having me.
no, no. Well, thank you, and I'm glad we got it worked out. Well, all right, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Heroes and Icons podcast with your host Greg Randolph. And once more, thank you so much to our guest Dave Hyde. And again, you can find the links to his books in the show notes for this podcast. Thank you again, everyone, for listening. Have a great night. God bless.